Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar COVID-19 and Academic Censorship with Dr. Molly Roberts, Qinlan Shen, and Dr. Shannon Oltmann. My name is Nabiha Syed, and I'm the president at The Markup, a new startup that investigates how technology reshapes society. Slightly relevant to what we're talking about today. This webinar is being hosted in support of Banned Books Week, an annual event that celebrates freedom to read. It spotlights current and historical attempts to censor books in libraries and schools. Working with the American Library Association and its Office for Intellectual Freedom, SAGE is proud to be a longtime supporter of the event. All right, so let's begin by asking our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. They have so much expertise in so many different areas. It's really a treat to be able to talk about one of my most favorite and also terrifying topics of censorship with these folks. So let's start off with Dr. Molly Roberts. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm an associate professor at UC San Diego in the political science department and the Hasidioglu Data Science Institute. I study digital politics with a particular focus on censorship and propaganda in China. I also study political methodology and the use of statistics in social science. Really looking forward to talking to you about censorship today.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. Next, Qinlan Shen.
Hi, my name is Qinlan Shen. I'm a PhD candidate at the Language Technologies Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And my research focuses on the intersection of basically social science and natural language processing. So a lot of my research has been focused mainly on the moderation of offensive language in social media spaces, which ties in quite heavily with censorship, especially for more sensitive topics like political discussion. So I'm really excited to be joining you today to offer my insights into looking at moderation and censorship on social media.
Oh, wonderful. I can't wait to hear your expertise. Every time I fire up a different social platform, I feel like I should know more about exactly what's working under the hood there. So finally, Dr. Shannon Oltmann, tell us a little bit about yourself and your expertise too.
Yes, I am an associate professor in the School of Information Science at the University of Kentucky. I study censorship in libraries, but also across the broader landscape, the broader society. Study information ethics, information privacy, and really how we enable or constrain our civil liberties, particularly freedom of speech. I spent a lot of time thinking about access to information or its sort of converse censorship in various contexts. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion here.
Oh, wonderful. I can't wait to dig in. Like, as a media lawyer myself, I've spent my career litigating around those issues. So when you hold a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's all lawsuits. And what's so great about this conversation is we'll be digging into the social dynamics, the realities of what we're seeing, and also how things are changing in the new virtual reality we all find ourselves in. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. So this is a 1-hour webinar. It's going to be recorded and archived for future viewing if you want to revisit the wisdom that will certainly be shared in the next hour. SAGE will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks, so look out for that. If any of you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, you can just use that little Q&A box that's on the side. And one of SAGE's helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. We will have time for a Q&A from attendees. So as you hear folks chatting, think about your questions. Please do share them. We're very excited to be in conversation with you. Please also take note of the hashtag #BannedBooksWeek, and feel free to ask your questions on Twitter or leave comments there. We will be checking, so we'd love to bring that into the conversation also. So without further ado, let's get this started. So the topic we're exploring is censorship. And I know for myself, at least, when we imagine censorship, I think of books being outright banned, books being burnt, people losing jobs as a retaliation for an unpopular opinion, that sort of thing, with very clear consequences. But if you think about what the core of censorship means, censorship is defined as suppressing access to information. And if you think about suppression as the core, then you can think about censorship taking a lot of different forms. So censorship can take root when there's so much bad information, it drowns out the good. censorship happens when someone self-censors out of fear of retaliation. They suppress their own thoughts to save themselves. And so before we dive into specific examples and what we're seeing right now, I would just love for each of our panelists who have experience in academic institutions, libraries, other countries, and a variety of online platforms, can you just share a little bit about how you think of the concept of censorship in your respective work? Molly, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, I've thought a lot about this because defining censorship is sort of at the core of trying to think about what the impact of censorship might be, or what the strategy of censorship might be. Is a lot of what I study. So in my recent book, Censored, I talk about 3 sort of types of censorship, and I think we think of censorship a lot through one of the lenses, but not through the other 2. And just to make them really easy to remember, they all start with S. So the first one is fear, that censorship can work through fear, where people maybe are deterred from talking or sharing or accessing information because of some punishment. And that's mostly how we think about censorship. Like, there's a law that means that you can't share something, and therefore there's some punishment that comes out. And this would create self-censorship. And that's certainly a really important form of censorship. But I think that we don't often think about the other 2 forms of censorship, which I talk a lot about, which is friction and flooding. So friction is where you can access a piece of information, but there are certain costs of access to that particular information. So this could be, for example, a government slowing down a website, or reordering search results, or removing certain content, or blocking it with a firewall. You can get around that, but because there are extra costs of access, then that means it's harder to do, right? And often people won't be aware that those costs exist, so they might not know that it's the government slowing those things down or removing those posts. And then the last form of censorship that I think about a lot is flooding. And this is not what you would think about as censorship, because it's adding information. But if you flood in the information environment enough to drown out other perspectives, then it has the same effect as friction, as it makes it more difficult for people to piece out what the good information is from the bad information. So those are the 3 ways that I think about censorship.
Oh, wow. That's such a helpful frame. And I know, Qinlan, since you research online platforms, I feel like friction and flooding are in particular very interesting. All 3 are interesting dynamics. I'd love to hear sort of how you think about censorship in your space too.
Yes, thanks for the explanation, Molly, on the other dynamics involved in censorship, because again, I normally think of censorship as an issue of suppression in my work, but obviously flooding and such are such a big deal on social media platforms. But the way I think about censorship in my work is kind of the intersection between censorship and governance in online communities. So online communities, there's been an increasing amount of hateful or abusive content in all sorts of social media platforms, from Facebook to Twitter to Reddit to YouTube. There's been a huge influx of often abusive content in the form of offensive language, hate speech, just in spam and such. But what happens with governance in online communities is that moderation plays an important role in kind of maintaining the health of these online communities. And often, because of the scale of these online platforms, they often rely on volunteer moderators to do this work of basically curating the content in these spaces. Obviously, there are social media platforms that do play a big role in the types of content that they share, that they allow on their platforms. But unlike other forms of censorship that a lot of people think about, the kind of information control that I look at is the work of these online moderators, and how even if it's not a explicit entity controlling, or explicit group in power controlling information, how that interacts with people's perceptions of whether or not they are allowed to express their opinions on this online platform, especially with regards to sensitive discussions, such as talking about political and social issues. Oftentimes, this is a very complex interaction. Oftentimes, people will cite censorship as a reason for why content moderation should be looser. And my work kind of tries to think about to what extent you can kind of argue the line between maintaining a healthy community and not drawing such attention on such, well, not relying on, not triggering these kinds of reactions from the users who portray these. But one of the complexities of like looking at censorship from the perspective of online moderation, though, is that often it's not exactly clear whether or not what takes place is actually censorship or if it's some other form of necessary content curation. So I'd be really
Oh,
interested
well.
in hearing a lot of perspectives on this. So
Yeah, I would definitely look to dig into the ambiguity there, because that seems like something that, at least in the political environment we have now, is a particularly explosive set of charges leveled at either side. So I definitely want to get into that. Shannon, you have so much experience in academic institutions and a variety of other landscapes. What does censorship mean to you in this moment? How are you identifying it and seeing it surface? Oh, Shannon, I'm not sure. I can't hear your audio.
I'm sorry, is that better?
There we go. Yeah, that's
Okay,
much better. Thank you.
my apologies. I was saying I'm enjoying this conversation because it's giving me some fresh ways to look at censorship. I think traditionally censorship was thought of as something the government imposed. Um, it's a law, it's a rule, it's a regulation about what people are able to access, and it's something the government hands down. But as the other panelists have said, that's not always the case. A lot of times, moderation or suppression of information or flooding of information comes from those around us, our peers, our friends, corporations. Corporations have enormous power, wield enormous power in this landscape currently, right? So they have comparable or more power than governments to suppress or share information. So we really need to expand the traditional conceptions of censorship, which I hear the other panelists doing, and I think that's really refreshing. I also think, to me, censorship is all about a lack of access. So, however that access is being prevented, sometimes it's your restricted access, whether that's books being taken off the shelf or put behind the desk and kids can't get to the books, or if it's flooding information. I think that's a great perspective that Molly brought up. It makes me think of the 24-hour news cycle and how we're just bombarded with so many tidbits of information that sometimes the most important information gets lost or gets overwhelmed and we don't have time to focus on it. And sometimes those moves are deliberate, right? People are trying to distract us from really important information. And I think about the content moderation as well. I have really mixed feelings on content moderation, so I'll stop there and see what what you have to say.
Well, wonderful. I can't wait to get into that question in just a little bit. And now, so before we get there, I'm gonna tease out this really interesting strand you brought up, Shannon, of the idea of sort of the governmental, the fear-based, the very like restrictive censorship versus what may happen on sort of the private realm. And as a media lawyer, as a First Amendment lawyer in the United States, I've always looked at preventing government, like heavy-handed restriction of information circulation. And so early in my career, I really looked at private companies providing access to the internet, for example, as a real beacon of freedom, of like, great, this is a way to circumvent any rules that might be there. The internet wants us to be free. We route around all damage, all of these platitudes that felt like very 2008. But you see some of them coming up now. So one undeniable reality of COVID-19 is that everything's gone online, including us right now. And there's this narrative, that again, picking up on that narrative, the internet is a workaround to the suppression of information. Now everyone can come to every panel. Now we're reducing barriers to access. We can distribute knowledge to everybody. And so there's one perspective that imagines this moment as quite a liberating one, working against censorship. But is technology actually the great equalizer here? Shannon, I know you've done a lot of work on the digital divide that people are experiencing right now, and I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's such an optimistic outlook on technology in our society, but perhaps a little naive as well. Um, the truth is, technology's tentacles don't extend everywhere. We can think about the digital divide in terms of access, skills, and technology. So some people are just lacking the technology to bridge the digital divide. They don't have computers or good computers. They don't have broadband access. They don't have a cell phone. They're lacking the technology. Some people are lacking access to information. So maybe maybe they live in a authoritarian regime and their government is blocking access to certain information. And then some people lack the skills to be able to get to the information they want. And these are all different types of digital divides. Probably the most relevant to our conversation is the access and the technology aspects of the digital divide, because they really prevent people from accessing the information they want. The really forms of censorship, you could say. And I think it's so prevalent or so relevant to this time of COVID-19. We really have to be conscious that moving things online is not a panacea. It's not an easy answer. And some things moved online are actually going to be more difficult for some people to attend, for some people to interact with. Depending on the audience you're trying to reach, moving things online may actually be more complicated and more difficult.
I see a lot of head nods from Qinlan and Molly, if there's anything you want to jump in with. All right, then I'm going to move on to my, oh, go ahead, please.
So this isn't exactly my area of expertise, but it's more about talking about personal experiences with attending virtual conferences, which in a way people have touted as one of the great equalizers of this pandemic, which is because most conferences have moved to a virtual environment, they tend to be more accessible for people who didn't necessarily have the funds or the ability to travel to a physical conference. And in a way, this does increase some of the access to information to underrepresented groups who attend these conferences. But on the other hand, with my experiences with attending virtual conferences, yes, the registration prices are cheaper. Yes, I can go online while in between work hours to look at talks. But on the other hand, it's often the case where it seems that sometimes you do miss a lot of the interaction and access this way. So personal experiences with attending virtual conferences is often things I wanted to attend or at time zones that I would not be able to normally access with my regular working schedule. And also, one of the things that I did find very interesting about my experiences attending virtual conferences is that rather than doing presentations, sessions were more interactive. So you were able to talk to, say, authors of papers directly. But it may often be harder to join the conversation if you've, say, read the paper but don't necessarily understand how to exactly engage in this conversation with someone directly. So it may be a harder leap for someone who's, let's say younger in their academic career. So.
Yeah, I think you know, as I agree with what both the other panelists have said. I think you know, as our world becomes more virtual, we have more and more of this problem of information overload, which is there's so much information, there's so many things to do online that we can't possibly do all of those. And as we enter that world, it becomes increasingly important who is prioritizing that information for us, right? So who is deciding, who is saying, these are the things that you should read? And increasingly, those are platforms. And instead of our personal physical networks, those are platforms. And so I think, you know, while there are all of these opportunities with the internet and access to information, we also have to be aware of how much control and power platforms have over what we read, what is easier to access and what is harder to access, and what their incentives are and who is influencing them. And I think that those are the big questions about censorship. Also, you know, in addition to all of these other considerations that are really important about differences in access between, you know, the digital divide, which are so important to understanding how this virtual world is playing out across different groups of people.
Molly, what you were saying makes me think of European Union directives to Google, YouTube, other big tech to remove terroristic posts as quickly as possible. The EU is pushing guidelines for them to remove terroristic posts within 24 hours or less. At first you might think, oh, jihadist posts or posts that advocate bombing or things like that, that might sound reasonable to get that stuff off the internet so it's not swaying more people, so it's not influencing and building movements. But my question is always, who defines that? Who defines what terrorism is, right? The difference between terrorism and freedom fighter is a matter of perspective. Oftentimes it's a matter of history, right? And it's much more nuanced than government directives seem to point towards, and that's where issues of censorship can arise.
I find what I find so fascinating about the sort of European countries' push for that kind of regulation is that it's an interesting conundrum for many of the platforms to be in, who have said for a very long time, steeped in a particular libertarian tradition of free speech in the US, we can't possibly do that. This is totally impossible. It's not doable. And it's like, well, you're going to have to. So now you have to figure out how to do that. And what I'd love to hear more about, and maybe Qinlan, this is for you, Molly, for everyone, is for me, the devil's always in the details, right? Of the mechanics of who is making that decision. How is that decision being made? Qinlan, you mentioned volunteers. What are the guidelines, the definitions, the timeline of response needed to make those kinds of decisions, and how does that lead to inadvertent censorship or you know, biased censorship? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that too.
Yes, it's interesting that you mentioned a lot of these issues involving defining who makes the guidelines and how quickly we should respond to these guidelines, since one of my older works on looking at the perception of censorship in online spaces looks at how some of these issues actually contribute to this perception of censorship for community participants. So oftentimes guidelines, if you read them across different social media platforms or different communities on these social media platforms, they read pretty similarly a lot of the times, but some of the things that fall in these guidelines are quite difficult to define. So something like a personal attack, where it's like an insult directed towards someone you're responding to, may seem easy to define or identify if you're looking at it from the outside. But something that's a little bit harder is, let's say, if you have a subtle insult, such as someone sarcastically commenting whoosh to represent you missed this point. And that could be something that could be considered offensive in this community. And oftentimes there are these kind of more ambiguous rules, such as do not be rude or disrespectful. There we go. On these platforms, where the definition of disrespectful, it's difficult to define. It depends on person to person, community to community. And oftentimes this ambiguity on how to define disrespectful gives some leeway in terms of how to interpret this rule. So oftentimes it's some kind of mismatch in terms of how people define this is disrespectful, but I don't find this as being disrespectful. Another issue that you find a lot in moderation is time-based, which is oftentimes the amount of content moderators have to look at far exceeds their ability to analyze each piece of text in great detail. So they often have to make flash judgments because they need to maintain these kinds of like this kind of order within their communities. So in the case of the your EU decision on a lot of these online platforms, 24 hours may not seem like too short of a time period, but considering the amount of content that like gets uploaded on, say, like YouTube or Facebook on a daily basis, that is a lot of content for volunteer moderators to look at in such a short time frame. So,
do you think AI can handle that effectively?
There's been a big push, at least within the natural language processing NLP community, in developing like models to kind of help in doing so. I would say we're not quite there yet because a lot of these models require some kind of strict definition of like what we want to look at. And often what we want to look at is community dependent, platform dependent. And we're still working, at least from that perspective, on kind of how do we incorporate these more contextual cues of how to like make our models better rather than relying on like simple methods for detecting general abusive content in online spaces. So there's a great push in our field to try to address this issue, but we're not quite there yet because a lot of the issues of definition in traditional moderation also trickles down to what we do.
Great. So one question I have is when you moderate something off one platform, what is the interplay between platforms, right? You hear a lot about platforms like Gab and other ones that sort of pop up, and from a single platform's perspective, it may be advantageous to introduce friction in terms of access to those ideas. Like, we're not killing it outright, but you got to search a little harder to find it. But I'm curious about how you sort of see that frontier of whack-a-mole, really, like move it off of Facebook and then it blossoms in a billion different places. And I'd love to hear from anyone on the panel about, you know, what they're seeing in that realm.
So I have some perspectives on that, mostly from my work on Reddit, which looks at a form of community level moderation called quarantining. So Reddit, if you're not familiar, if the audience isn't familiar with it, is basically a content aggregation and rating site in a way, but there's a lot of different subcommunities within Reddit which operate on certain topics, so politics, music, various hobbies and such. And so generally Reddit has a very libertarian view of how communities pop up, how they're moderated. Usually volunteers within the community self-moderate, but in some few occasional incidents, the Reddit administration does kind of jump in and do some form of moderation at the community level. So you can ban subreddits, which are these communities that pop up on Reddit. But one of the more interesting ones that has been used more commonly recently is this soft form moderation with quarantining, where these communities still exist on Reddit. They're just harder to access. You can't search them. They're not monetized. You get a warning if you try to access them. And what's interesting about quarantines is that once a subreddit has been quarantined, the general trajectory of these subreddits is that they do get banned eventually. There's not really a procedure for subreddits to become unquarantined, but like part of the reason why this is a little bit interesting is because the original users on these subcommunities can still engage in the same kinds of conversation that they did before the quarantine was applied. It doesn't change how you talk on these, it only changes access to these communities. And oftentimes some communities there's some evidence of some communities using this kind of like quarantine as a warning of like possibly a future ban. So the classic example in this case was the Donald, which was a very large subreddit dedicated to support for President Donald Trump. It was quarantined in June of last year, but it already had some kind of special cases within the Reddit community in terms of how it was handled compared to other subreddits. But ever since, so it was quarantined in June, there was still some participation going on within this community up until February, where the Reddit administration applied even stronger restrictions on this community, and this was considered kind of a last straw, and they've kind of moved off Reddit to form their own community. I forgot what it was called I forget what this community is called at the moment, but there was basically a mass exodus of users from Donald to this new community, run and moderated by themselves. And eventually, coinciding with with increased interest in the Black Lives Movement this year, the Donald was eventually banned. But at this point, a lot of Reddit users who were familiar with this environment were like, this is not enough because everyone has already kind of moved on from the Donald. So this is often seen as like a kind of a
Like too little, too late, kind of.
yeah kind of yeah.
Yeah.
So
well, thank you for that help. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, so it's kind of interesting to think about in terms of these cases where, like, oftentimes like deplatforming has been shown to work, quote unquote, work in terms of like looking at it from the perspective of a single community, aka Reddit. But oftentimes you lose track of like what's going on for this group and oftentimes if you use like more soft forms of moderation, you give people the opportunity to kind of coordinate and perform these like migrations. So.
Oh wow, that's so fascinating. I want to switch gears just for a second to make sure we squeeze it in before it's time for Q&A for the audience, and also for the folks in the audience, start thinking about your questions because we'll be taking them in just over 5 minutes. So I wanted to think about a slightly different set of platforms, and that's online virtual communications platforms, particularly online virtual learning platforms. So I was reading about how earlier in the summer, Zoom, which became ubiquitous for everybody all of a sudden in March, Zoom admitted to censoring certain calls at Beijing's request. And as an adjunct professor myself, I teach about the law of investigative journalism. I immediately worried about the risk of using Zoom for some of my international students because Zoom captures your IP address, faces, voices, rich data. And I was pretty concerned about that, but the university that I adjunct at still uses Zoom, and many places do. How have you guys been seeing sort of that concern about Zoom or foreign governments using sort of more heavy-handed forms of censorship via these on virtual platforms manifest as in conversations on academic campuses? Like, is this a conversation that's happening? How are you guys thinking about it? And Molly, why don't we jump in with you? Because I know you've thought a lot about censorship and the political landscape of censorship in China.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is a really important conversation to be having. So just kind of following up on, what we've been talking about, platforms have an enormous impact on us because they can prioritize information for us. They take an incredible amount of data on us. And when these platforms take directions from governments, that can be really dangerous because censorship can happen. In the case of Zoom, for example, it can, surveillance can happen. So there's a lot of really important problems with the influence of governments over companies. I think this is something, during this time period of COVID, we've also had the introduction of the national security law, which technically pertains to anyone in the world, coming from China, basically saying that anything that this very broad base of information that could be conceived of undermining the Chinese government, is not allowed to be discussed, and people could have and there would be repercussions for that. And in this virtual environment, when people are teaching topics about Chinese politics, and where some of their students are in mainland China using online platforms, that becomes very concerning. So there have been a lot of conversations, at least in my world, about how do we first of all teach courses without self-censoring, with teaching all the content that we want to be teaching, that we think is relevant, that is sticking to the guidelines of academic freedom, at the same time making sure that we don't endanger students and making sure that students understand the risks that might be taken, because we can't, on any platform, we can't guarantee confidentiality. And I mean, it could be that other students are recording. It could be that, even if we have regulations in place. And so we want to make sure that people are aware of that. So there have been, a few different organizations that have come up with guidelines in this area, like the Association of Asian Studies came up with some recommendations. And I think that those are, like the culmination of a lot of discussion over how to best go about this. But I think these are really, really important issues, and we have to keep discussing them. Yeah.
Qinlan, Shannon, do you want to jump in?
I don't have anything to add. I think Molly covered it really well. Sorry.
No, that's great. And I love the concrete suggestions. I've definitely already had several students ask if, could they, would it be possible for them to do, I usually run classes with like lots of questions and comments. They're like, can I text you my questions via Signal ahead of time? Is there some other way I could communicate with you in a way that is a little bit more private? And it has been interesting to think about what you said, Molly, about how you can't ever guarantee the full confidentiality in really any fora. Someone can always be recording, someone can be sitting and auditing the class if it's a big class, but it is something that we have to think about the affordances of this particular reality we have right now, and how easy it makes it. It removes friction, to use one of your helpful 3 Fs, which by the way I'm going to be using all day. Like such a helpful breakdown of censorship. I have another question for you. Then there's a bunch of very good questions in the comments. So my last question before I go on to the better ones that people in the audience are providing is, in my field of work, I work with a lot of investigative reporters. I have for years, who in recent years have really complained about how much harassment they receive for just doing their jobs online, right? There's gruesome Twitter mobs, they get doxxed, posting of private details, harassment, and it sort of transformed this space from freewheeling discussion with anybody, this like leveling of anyone can talk to anyone, to something that's quite much more fraught. And is the fear of online harassment sort of present in the same way in the academic world and academic circles? Like, how are professors and academics thinking about that realm?
I'm glad you brought this up, because I'm actually working on a research project that looked at a website called Professor Watchlist, which collected the names of professors and other university employees who allegedly advanced leftist propaganda or discriminated against conservative students in the classroom. Several hundred people were on the list. And so I interviewed people who were on the list to see if it affected their academic freedoms, the way they taught, the way they conducted their research. A number of people said, well, some said it was a badge of honor to be on this list. I've pissed off the right people. I'm very proud of that. But many people had a less cavalier attitude. They had received death threats, rape threats. They had people calling their provost and university president, calling for their job termination. And for some people, it did affect the way they teach, the way they conduct their research, the sorts of questions they ask, how they interact with their students. So I think some of that is present. I think there is some fear of sort of a gotcha culture, where students may be recording lectures, or taking now lectures that are available online and taking moments out of context, right? I think there are fears of that, and I don't know good answers for those concerns. And it's very difficult for me because I'm a free speech maximalist, so I believe virtually all the speech we should allow. The more speech, the better. It allows us to hear a wide variety of ideas. It allows us to figure out what ideas are the best. It also allows us to figure out ideas which ideas are the worst, and to keep track of the worst ideas. So we know where the really awful ideas are coming from. We know the really dark, scary corners of the internet. We can keep an eye on them so we know what they're up to. If we deplatform folks off of, say, Twitter, and then they're on a less popular network, are the police and FBI going to know about a less popular network? Are they going to monitor it? I'm not saying that I want the FBI monitoring everybody's social media. I'm just saying if we start moderating and deplatforming people, that leads to a whole cascade of problems that sometimes people don't think about.
Yeah, I think that's a very traditional American understanding of censorship,
Yes.
right? Which is like
Yes.
we should have none of it, clear the field, everything can happen. One question we have from the audience are related to that, and Qinlan and Molly, I definitely want your international comparative perspectives on that counter or running counter to that American vision. But one question is, how do you see the discrediting of information and gaslighting impacting the free flow of information? And I think about this a lot as like a woman of color, visibly online, as like, if I had any thinner skin, I would probably have been like, you know what, I'm going to take my ideas about police brutality and a variety of other things just off the internet. Like, why would I invite this? Which is an interesting form of self-censorship, right? And as a First Amendment lawyer, I wonder a lot about how we sort of tabulate that into the on balance like assessment of free speech, of how do we even count the people who've been gaslighted, harassed off the platforms, self-censoring because they don't want the repercussions. Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, but I definitely want panelists to answer this question about, you know, how do we talk about gaslighting and how do we talk about that impact?
Please, other panelists.
I don't know if I have a good answer to that question because, again, it is difficult to see what voices are missing, for example. But I don't know if any other panelists have some perspectives.
Yeah, so I think this is a big dilemma, right? Because on the one hand, you know, I am also really a believer in the open flow of information and open discussion. And I think that, you know, that has strengthened our, you know, the academy. It's strengthened the way that we think about politics, et cetera. On the other hand, the open flow of information is often now being used as a form of censorship, right? Which is through flooding and gaslighting and trying to sort of, and so how do we figure out how to make that balance? I think that's a really difficult question. And I think part of it is, I mean, I don't have the answers to this. I think this is, but I do think part of it is trying to figure out who should be making, you know, those decisions, and you know, how can we make those decisions democratically as much as possible? Or, you know, so if a platform wants to be competitive, you know, if we do have competition between platforms, which is something I think is important, and a platform wants to be competitive, maybe they'll have an incentive to make sure that all voices are, you know, that this is a healthy, you know, environment for people to participate in. So, you know, should, for example, the government be making those decisions, that makes me really nervous, but maybe competition between platforms, or self-moderation within communities where rules are, you know, posted transparently and sort of decided on by that community itself. So how could we make those decisions about what that balance is democratically, I think is one thing I think about a lot.
Yeah, it's such a puzzle, because I think a lot about both who decides and also what is the type of speech that we're talking about. So for example, in another time, if I were having a debate about banning a particular book, like this type of information is so sensitive, no one should look at it, I might be having that conversation with people who already know me from the local public school, for example. Like there's an entire universe of context around the human beings having the conversation with one another. But on online platforms, it gets decontextualized. So it's really just like, I don't like your idea, you don't like my idea. There's no context that's involved, which can help like lubricate a conversation that might otherwise be it have a lot of friction. And I think a lot about the architecture of the systems that we have online strip out a lot of that context,
Mhm.
because who takes the time to dig in? And we have a question here, which I'd be curious for your reactions and reflections to, about precisely one of those attempts to introduce some kind of context. And the question is, what about fake news warnings like Twitter has started doing? Does that censor information? And this is my addition to the question, or does that add context, right? Does it add context to say, this has not been verified, or
Mhm.
this is actually demonstrably untrue? Is that context or is that censorship?
Whew, that's a really
Mm.
tough one. I want to go back to what we were talking about a moment ago, just real quick, and
Sure.
add in, while I'm a free speech maximalist, I also really, really value the speech of marginalized and traditionally oppressed groups, and I really don't want to do things that dissuade them from having their voice, right? I want to amplify voices of marginalized, traditionally oppressed people. As a queer woman myself, that's super important to me. Um, but I also don't want to do that in a patronizing way. So there's a lot of complicated forces going on there. In terms of labeling fake news, well, I think the phrase fake news is has had its time and is not useless. I think it's become so politicized. That phrase, I think, is no longer has merit, at least in the American context. Um, but labeling something as like, this comes from Cousin Joe's website, not from the New York Times or something, I think that is useful. Um, I think it's on us as individuals and us as communities in a society to become better educated about what is a quality news source, what does it mean to um, have citations, to have firsthand news accounts, those sorts of things. Um, you know, what does a reputable news source mean, and how can I identify it? I don't think enough Americans, probably enough people around the world, can answer that question confidently.
Wonderful. We have a couple of questions that go back to sort of the more established understandings of censorship, let's say, the more sort of formal, fear-based ones. And one thought-provoking question is, why is it that none of you seem to suggest that users and people in academia may be perfectly aware of the fact that they're actually facing censorship or retrieving censored information? Is that because it actually doesn't happen? Like, do people not know what they don't know? And what happens to the users who do know that they're accessing censored information? Like, what are the repercussions they can expect?
So if I understand the question, I correctly, hopefully I do, but so one of the things that I think is really important when we think about censorship and the impact of censorship is the awareness of censorship, right? So in a fear-based censorship, you have to be aware of censorship in order for it to work, because you have to be deterred for something. So you have to be aware of what's off limits. You have to be aware of what you can say or can't access and can't access. And because of that, either it works very well, or often censorship will backfire. We've seen a lot of backfire instances of censorship, Streisand effects, as people call them, or just people getting angry about censorship and actually organizing around censorship. So we do see that sometimes. I think that one of the tricky parts about online censorship is that a lot of times through friction and blame, people don't actually have to be aware of censorship when it's happening. So if censorship is just burying something in a news feed, I don't really know what I'm missing. It's an unknown unknown. And because of that, I sort of don't ever, I can have this perception, and I've talked to a lot of people in censored environments who have a perception that they're actually getting all but then when you ask them about specific events, they don't know anything about them, even though these are sort of big news, right? So, so I think that can happen in these sort of more access-oriented censorship, where you may not, this information overload, if you only see and only are, introduced to a certain subset of it, you may not even know that censorship is happening. And I think that's something that's really important. And I also think that if censorship, a platform that is moderating content, that transparency is really important because of this. Being aware of what types of things are being removed helps people sort of update about what information that they're missing, and make sure that censorship is fair, and also censorship or moderation in this sense, right, is consistent with community, the standards of the community there, sort of like what Qinlan was talking about with people posting, this is the standard that we have and how we're interpreting it.
Well, that surfaces another question that we were asked, which is how much of the friction on a particular platform is actually transparent, right? How much of it is baked into the algorithmic programming of platforms and software and the database structuring? And when I hear that question, I think there's so little that we know so little about how that works. We just know, and that's something that I know the investigative reporters in my shop definitely spend a lot of time trying to figure out, and it's a shifting space. So I'd love to hear reactions to that of, how do we even begin to surface the internal structures that do introduce this friction into how this all works, which is ultimately part of who decides.
I think those are trade secrets, right? That's what gives different platforms a proprietary edge. So they're not going to want to tell us anything about their friction.
Yeah, that was very similar to what I was going to comment on, which is I think most social media researchers are well aware of algorithmic biases, but it's kind of difficult to kind of have even a proxy for these because these are trade secrets. So the best we can do, at least from my perspective, is to kind of get proxies. So like who's following who, even though we don't know traceable history of that, which communities tend to be associated with which communities, but we don't. But even for something as simple as, like, say, an upvote downvote score on Reddit, we don't know the mechanics behind that, even because it's a trade secret that can be easily manipulated if it is well known to the public. So.
Well, we have a couple more questions, but just a couple more minutes. This one is going back again to a sort of more traditional form of censorship. Are there any emerging trends in public school library book censorship that school librarians should be aware of? So again, not the sort of vague, more not more vague, but this online version, but just tangibly, are there books that we should be watching out for? And Shannon, I wonder if you have some insights onto this front.
Yeah, I think books that touch on sort of the social issues of the moment are often considered controversial. So transgender issues seem to be controversial still. LGBTQ issues in general in some communities can still be controversial. Things like Black Lives Matter, social justice movements. Last year there was a public library in the St. Louis area that had a social justice story hour. The kids read a book about, or the kids were read a book about Black activists who made a difference in their communities, and then they made it like a wreath with their handprints or something. Nothing, out of the realm of typical story time, but it still raised a ruckus within the community. So I would say those sorts of issues, anything that could be a hot button topic in terms of social issues in your community. And the thing to do is just remember that your community is not just the people who come through your library doors the most often, or the people who look like you, or the people who talk like you. Your community consists of a lot more than that. Even in the most white bread, conservative, pedestrian sort of Midwestern town, that's where I was born and raised, right? there are still people of color, there are still LGBTQ individuals. You may not know them, but I promise they're probably in your town. There are still people who are probably not Christian. There are still people who have different political views. And so having a wide range of topics and having books that speak to people on a wide range of perspectives is really important.
Wonderful. Well, I know we have just a couple minutes left, and I like to, especially in these times, to close with something that feels like people can take some power into their own hands. Um, you know, how can an average person help combat censorship? What are the questions they should be asking about what they see every day? How can they be allies to, the public school librarians? What is a piece of advice you would give to folks who are navigating both the sort of formal forms of censorship that we see and the other versions that are emerging in this time? It's a question for each of you.
A difficult question to answer, but I kind of wanted to tie it back to like an earlier question about the use of fake news alerts, which is basically to think about one of the things you can think about in terms of like trying to address censorship is think about who this is directed towards. Like if you see a fake news alert, who is it supposed to reach? Who is it supposed to impact? If you see like a moderation decision that occurs on a community level, who does this impact? What do you think about what kinds of people kind of participate in these spaces, and what do you expect these people to kind of do in response to these things? But in terms of like how would everyday people navigate the world of, I guess, our very censored world with flooded information and censorship and possibly even suppressed information in a lot of these spaces. I don't know if I have the best answer for that, but I think one of the things you do have to keep in mind is, I guess, like one of the things I took away from this was Molly's 3 S's and be aware that censorship can take many forms. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say don't be, try to not be naive, but follow up on your news, double check your news sources. Make sure you're looking at trusted news sources. Share your trusted news sources, share why you trust them, and be kind to the folks in your community and your social circles who do come from marginalized or oppressed communities, and find ways to
amplify their voices.
Yeah, amplify their voices. Thank you.
Yeah, so I agree with all of that advice, and I also think that a lot of times what we do on the internet, we do the things that are easy. We sort of are passive consumers of information sometimes, the things that and so trying to sort of think about what are the sources of information, just like Shannon and Qinlan were just saying, which sources are you getting them from? Can you make sure that they're trusted sources? Can you get them from a wide variety of trusted sources? And what is the evidence that supports the news and information that you're getting? How is it prioritized to you? I think thinking about those things can help sort of create a critical view of news that can help sort of fight censorship.
Amazing. Well, perfect timing. That is just about all the time we have for today. I want to thank each of you for joining us. I want to thank the audience for amazing, thought-provoking questions, and I'll definitely be mulling over. In the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for recording of the webinar. Again, thank you so much. Thank you to Sage Publishing for having us, and I hope you all have a good banned books week, or at least a thought-provoking one. Thanks, folks. Can they still see us? Thanks, folks. It was so great having this chat with you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I learned a lot. All right, bye.